Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello. Hey, everybody.
So we have another great topic lined up for you today, and we're excited. It's that time of year when we're right on the verge of spring. Oh my
Oh,
goodness,
yeah.
it's hard to be inside, isn't it, Layne?
It is. I find every excuse possible to go outside. I'm like, I think I need to check on this. Or
It's so true. So, like, you texted me, let's start early. And I thought, oh, well, I could start a few minutes early. Well, but I better take Tucker out. And so
oh,
we
yeah,
walked
of
and I
course.
peeked under the covers and looked at some of the flowers that Bobo had just planted last week and looked at some cool flowers. Anyway, super exciting time. So,
It
friends, we're just
is.
happy to be here with you today. And remember that this podcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com, where our mission is to help you grow more flowers all the time.
Yes,
And isn't that the truth, Layne? It's
it
like
is.
there's always something to do either in or for your garden, is my theory. So, Layne, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to kind of do a practical guide to understanding the Snapdragon groups in terms of how they relate to the bloom order you'll see out in the garden. And
Okay.
we're also going to talk about some other considerations when you're choosing which groups and varieties to plant to hopefully help avoid planting the wrong group at the wrong time, which can sometimes lead to a little bit of disappointment.
Yes, it's a topic that I see it very simply, but I see people make it very, very complicated. So great, let's get started.
All right, so most, not all, but most snapdragons are classified into groups, and sometimes you'll even see numbers in the name of a variety. So, Opus 3 early bronze, for example, that is referring to the group. So, why, Lisa, are snapdragons classified into groups, and how do those group designations relate to the bloom times?
So snapdragons are broken into groups to indicate when they're going to bloom, and that time is dictated by the day length as well as conditions, right? And I think it was all created so that commercial growers that produce year round could have some that produce really well in all conditions of the year, right? But we can make the best of that. And let's talk about how you kind of figure that out for your garden, right?
Yeah. So snapdragons, they're very sensitive and responsive to day length, light intensity, and temperature. And these group classifications are intended to help indicate the optimal bloom times for each variety to get the highest quality stems and flowers.
Yeah.
And so group one generally corresponds to shorter days and cooler temperatures, and group four is longer days and warmer temperatures. But we're going to go through what that actually means in terms of growing them out in the field.
Yes.
So snapdragons are winter hardy in your zone, Lisa, so you're able to fall plant. So when you plant all the different groups at the same time in the fall, they're naturally going to bloom in a little bit of succession out there for you in the spring. So group ones are going to flower earliest, group four are going to flower latest. So how much time do you notice between those different groups blooming?
Sure. So I want to just remind everybody, if you're listening to this on a podcast, if you head over to our YouTube channel, Layne has a beautiful slideshow going. I just love snapdragons. Those are great images, Layne.
They're
So
beautiful.
aren't they? It's the reason I always grow more snaps than we could ever need, you
Yeah.
know? So yes, in fact, the groups indicate when the flowers are going to bloom. It has nothing to do with when you actually plant them. I think that's a
Right.
really big confusion for folks. So literally, I mostly fall plant snapdragons because those end up performing the best for me here where I am. And I plant them all at the same time. So, we're planting 6 or 7 different varieties of snaps, all basically as soon as they're ready in the fall. And so my strategy is that I have learned through the years, Chantilly, which are group one, which means they bloom in the shorter, cool days of spring. And it's the first one to bloom in my garden. And I've learned through the years, we can count on Chantilly sometimes like late March, early April actually to bloom. And then, it really seems to work out beautifully for me. Having these different varieties, which just happen to be in different groups, and they just kind of start falling out like 7 to 10 days apart. Then this one will start and then that one will start. But they also continue to, we encourage branching on our snaps. So I'm still cutting chantillies when group 4 may be starting up. They might not be as great a quality, meaning as tall, perhaps, but they're still great for bouquet making. So yeah, it really, really works. And I find that chantilly is the earliest. Madam Butterfly comes along, Opus, um, and then Rocket snaps. Rocket is typically the latest that I'm looking for. Is that group 3 or 4? I can't remember, but it's one of the later groups. And when Rocket starts blooming, we're heading into the heat of summer around here. And so that's kind of, we plant them all at the same time, and then they bloom at their optimal time, and it works out beautifully in my succession planting.
And it is such a benefit with Snapdragons to be able to have the option of just planting at one time, and without you doing any additional work, they naturally bloom in that succession.
And that was why we created the TGW dragons, right? Because it's a mix of all of them so that you plant once in a color and they just bloom throughout all the conditions. So yeah, that's a great point.
And growing a mix like that, or just intentionally picking varieties from all the different groups, it's really great in a home garden setting because you can just have flowers for such an extended period of time. And then obviously, if you're a flower farmer, extending your Snapdragon season is a great thing because that's a really in-demand flower.
True, it's good for every market available.
Okay, so now I want to talk about planting some types possibly at a non-ideal time. And we're not going to go in detail about the optimal flowering times for each group, but I did want to point out that certain groups can work well at multiple times of year. So group 3s, for example, work well for spring blooms, but they're also a great choice for fall blooms. So just know that that's something you can look into if you're planting for flowers at a specific time of year.
Right.
So, what are some potential consequences of planting a given group at a non optimal time? So, let's say it's late spring and you decide you'd like some chantillies. That's what we're looking at on the screen. If you're over on YouTube, it's that beautiful open face variety. What might be some problems with planting chantilly, for example, in late spring?
So when you think about this, you're going to say, aha, no wonder. So Chantilly is in group 1, which means it likes to bloom under short days and cool conditions. So if you don't plant it until very early spring or eat later, think about it. It's already in its blooming condition time. So that's going to encourage it to bloom very short. So if you are going to plant in very early spring or a little bit later, then maybe this will help you connect the dots. That's when you say, that's when a group would become important to me. It's like I would want a later group, which means it would bloom later in the season. So that is a consequence. If you plant the earlier groups late in spring, they're going to bloom 10 inches tall. That's going to be a real problem.
So it might have a shorter stem. The stem quality can be worse. It can be like a bit puny, for lack
Right.
of a better term. And it is a good thing to note that a lot of times these groups, they can bloom outside of those optimal bloom times and bloom conditions, but it just might be a worse quality stem that you're looking at.
Right. Which if you're a flower farmer, that defeats the whole purpose.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say, potential consequences, for us planting in very early spring and later, we can grow snaps, and I can grow some pretty decent looking snaps, but I find that they fall victim to disease so much more likely because they just weren't as well established in cool conditions. So that's another consequence of planting out of their optimal time is they become more prone to disease issues.
So that kind of leads into our next question, which is going to be, what is your Snapdragon planting strategy, Lisa? And do you plant successions for summer blooms? So let me start by asking you, if you are planting successions in very early spring, what would be your strategy there in terms of groups and varieties?
So if I was doing a succession, which would be if you plant in the fall, that's your first succession, and very early spring would be your next succession. Um, in very early spring, I would definitely steer away from Chantilly and Madam Butterfly because those are my earlier bloomers. And again, I would, steer towards those more, those groups 3 and 4, Opus and Rockets, because they just naturally tend to bloom later.
Yeah.
So Yeah, and I just again have found the productivity, the health, and the abundance of fall planting. On my farm, we now don't do any very early spring planting. There is plenty of other things that we need to be very early spring planting. And so I learned that for the top quality, fall planting is unprecedented. I mean, there's no other replacement for that. And so we found that we would rather make the best use, because I'm a small space farmer. I would rather use that space instead of trying to get snaps longer. Why not grow more straw flowers, which are even in more demand than snapdragons are? And that is their time, is very early spring and on. So we've chosen to not very early. We only plant in the fall, to say it simply.
So you plant all the different groups in the fall. If you
Exactly.
were to plant in very early spring, you would be heading towards those later groups like 3
Yeah,
and 4.
exactly.
And then a lot of people do plant snapdragons for summer blooms, but you don't tend to do that. And you've already kind of touched on this, but what have you found when you've tried to grow snapdragons in our humid, hot southeastern Virginia climate in the summer?
Sure. So, rust is rampant, which is a very common disease that you just don't ever want to meet. I have never had rust on fall planted snaps. And so when we plant and try to grow summer blooms of snaps, even those snaps that are made to bloom in the summer, they still just fall victim to those. And then there's pests. Thrips are a big snapdragon threat. And we find that that is more likely to happen with our later blooms. So, all of those things added together, and the other part of, kind of part of our mission here at on my farm is we're very seasonally focused. So when it gets warm, our customers are like, we're done with snaps. Bring us some celosia plumes. They're ready for summer flowers. So we just don't grow summer snaps. And some people do it very, very well. We just can't seem to do it here.
Yeah, I was going to mention, depending on your climate, you may have great success growing snapdragons for summer blooms.
Right.
But I do like, Lisa, how simple it is. You can just plant in the fall. You get to enjoy a pretty long window. How long would you say your overall snapdragon window is from just those fall plantings of all the different groups?
We are so ready for snaps to go away. That's how long we have them. Chantilly, as I mentioned, can bloom as early as late March, definitely in April. Rocket typically does not make Mother's Day. So if it's, let's just say, early April through the end of June, so that's
Yeah.
almost 3 months. So that's a good long window. So I think the thing that we all fall victim to when we have a really beautiful flower, one that's maybe in demand, that people are like, oh, I'd love to have that all the time. When you're a flower farmer, you have to learn to know where to draw the line in the sand. And there are many other flowers that are much easier for us to grow in those appropriate conditions, that are as equally in demand. But it's so easy to try to, instead of trying to get zinnias earlier and snapdragons later, let's put everybody in their order, and there's plenty. And I think people really appreciate the change, the
Mhm.
seasonality, as well as I do. And it's just easier to grow them in their natural conditions.
It's so true. And obviously, feel free to experiment to see what works best in your conditions, but just keep some of these considerations in mind that we've talked about today when you're deciding which snapdragons to plant when.
Yes. And we appreciate y'all joining us here. And remember that the Gardener's Workshop is where our home base is, and you can find everything you need, from tools, supplies, seeds, education, everything we're up to, right, Layne?
Yes. So just thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And if you're enjoying Seed Talk, please make sure to share it with a friend, and also be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening.
All right, friends, until we meet again, ciao.
Bye.